Hi, welcome in. I'm Sue O'Connell. It's Lunch Hour Live at the Boston Public Library here with GBH. Thanks for joining us. It's Pride Month. Celebrations happening all across the country and the region, celebrating LGBTQI pride and identity. But, you know, we've got that draft opinion from Justice Alito from the Supreme Court that we are thinking about this June. The opinion seems, again, it's a draft, seems to strike down abortion rights, Roe v. Wade. And many LGBTQ activists are worried about what, if that happens, which many predict it will, what impact that will have on the right of LGBTQ gay Americans to enjoy the rights of same-sex marriage. And joining me to discuss is this a real fear? Is this a concern? What should we be doing is co-chair of the Massachusetts Gay and Lesbian Political Caucus, Arline Isaacson.
Hi, Sue. Happy Pride.
Happy Pride. Good to see you. And executive director of the GLBTQ Legal Advocates and Defenders. We call them GLAD. Janson Wu, welcome to both of you. We're going to talk about if the overturning of Roe v. Wade will threaten the rights to privacy, including those of same-sex marriage. So thanks to both of you for joining us, and let folks know in the audience at the Newsfeed Cafe, if you have questions, just let us know and we'll bring them to the panel. Janson, can you first give us a legal explanation that we'll understand as to why overturning Roe v. Wade could impact the right to legal same-sex marriage in the United States?
Absolutely. First of all, thank you so much for having me on here, and happy Pride to everybody. So I wanted to start by just acknowledging that the overturning of Roe v. Wade, even before we get to LGBTQ rights and the impact there, is going to harm millions of women and people who can get pregnant. And that's a real concern for all Americans who believe in women's rights, who believe in the ability to access necessary medical care, and also the LGBTQ community, because lesbian women, bisexual women are just as likely to have unintended pregnancies as straight women. And so we care about all of these issues. And it's also the case that, if you read that draft opinion that was leaked by Alito, you'd have to be, sticking your head in the sand, not to be concerned about what it can mean for not just, marriage equality, but a whole host of Supreme Court decisions that we have built over decades affirming the equal citizenship and dignity of LGBTQ Americans. And why is that the case? Why are they tied together? And it comes to this doctrine around fundamental freedoms or substantive due process that has been a heated battle amongst conservative and liberal justices on the US Supreme Court. This is a theory that there are certain rights that are so inalienable and so fundamental to our ideas of freedom that the government should not be able to intrude on those rights, even if they're not named in the Constitution. Marriage is not named in the Constitution. Abortion is not named in the Constitution. So many of the freedoms that we take for granted, the right to access contraception, is not named in the Constitution. And yet, over a century, the Supreme Court has held that these freedoms are so fundamental that it would be unconstitutional for a government to burden those rights. And that includes the freedom to marry. And so if you start to take away, or as Alito would prefer to do, demolish the foundation of fundamental rights that we have built so many civil rights upon, then at some point that edifice will topple and potentially bring marriage equality with it.
How is the Supreme Court decision that allowed LGBT folks to marry associated to Roe v. Wade?
So they both rely on a long history of case law that says that the right to decide how to create a family and how to kind of organize your family and how to have children and who to marry, all these are part of a fundamental right of privacy or autonomy that we should all enjoy regardless of your sexual orientation or your gender. And so Roe v. Wade and its protections are at the heart of that, right? And there's also differences. You know, when you look at the Obergefell decision, which affirmed the right for same-sex couples to marry, it's not only resting upon the fundamental right of autonomy and privacy, it's also resting upon this right of equality, the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, the fact that we cannot have second-class citizens based upon your sexual orientation. So there are similarities and there are differences, and I think the battle ahead will be how do we ensure that Obergefell is preserved and defended as strongly as possible.
Arline, you're on the political side, on the lawmaking side, where you work to forward LGBTQ rights. And you know, when we look back and we tell the story of how the same-sex marriage battle was won here in Massachusetts, it seems really easy, right? There's a whole timeline that we publish every June about how, you know, in the 70s we fought for this right, in the 80s we fought for this right, and then, you know, and it just went really easy. It wasn't, was it?
It was hell.
Yeah.
It was hellish. It was, the fight for marriage equality was a 10-year battle. People don't realize it lasted that long. But for 10 years, opponents of our right to marriage equality were working to prohibit us from ever having a right to marry. Just like for years before that, they fought against us having equal treatment under the law, just like they fought against us having the ability to have kids or to be foster parents or to not be discriminated against. Or during the AIDS crisis, they wanted to put us on an island in Boston Harbor. Yes, there were bills to do that. So the trajectory of LGBTQ equality has been long. It does bend towards justice, but only because we and our allies have worked so damn hard for it. It has not come easily, and this decision is particularly, this leaked Roe decision is especially scary because some of those rights that we have been taking for granted are now done and settled. They may not be. As Janson pointed out, the right to marriage equality, it could be challenged. The right to have intimate, private, consensual, adult, non-commercial relationships, AKA sex, could be threatened. The right to contraception. There's a whole litany of issues that are being threatened right now. And just like we always thought, most people thought Roe was a settled issue, that we never had to worry about losing the right to choose, we can have problems going forward on any of these battles for equality that we won.
Janson, one of the things I'm pretty sure that if you had asked us 10 years ago if Roe v. Wade was under assault, we would say yes. And I think we would have said probably before that it's just because it's settled law doesn't mean that it's not under attack. And if you're paying attention to these things, which most people aren't because they're normal people, not like us, and that they have real lives, they're shocked. And if this becomes, Roe v. gets overturned in June, there's this thing called trigger laws, which will happen where 20-some states will immediately be able to outlaw abortion in almost every single case. Can you talk about if there are any trigger laws in place for same-sex marriage that if the court were able to overturn the right to marry, are there defensive marriage acts that define marriage only between a man and a woman? Are those still on the books somewhere?
That's a great question. So, just to go to the abortion context first, there's the trigger laws which were passed in anticipation of Roe being overturned. And then there was the pre-Roe laws that were still on the books, right? These laws.
Because lawmakers don't take laws off the books.
It's a lot of work just to get them to make any decisions, right? So there's all these, I've heard some people call the zombie laws that could, be revived to life should the constitutional prohibitions against those laws be removed. And so, for example, my sister is an abortion provider. She lives in Michigan. Michigan has one of those zombie laws that will be fiercely contested as to whether or not it will be enforced or not. In the marriage equality context, no state thus far has passed a trigger law in anticipation of Obergefell being overturned. But there are over half the states in this country that have constitutional amendments that define marriage as between one man and a woman, or a statute that defines marriage as between one man and a woman, and all those will become deeply contested at a state-by-state level should Obergefell be overturned.
And you can count on the fact that the radical right, who hate us and fear us, will be chomping at the bit to take advantage of those trigger laws, those laws that are in the books prohibiting our right to marriage equality in other states. they will absolutely try and move those forward and challenge them in the court. And who knows with the Supreme Court what they'll end up doing. Just because Alito said that his leaked decision would apply only to abortion, he can't control all the other justices, and the justice tomorrow might say, no, I think it applies to marriage equality too.
We're talking with Janson Wu and Arline Isaacson. Arline, we tend to in Massachusetts think we have this little bubble around us regarding keeping us safe from terrible things that we think happen. Is there a scenario where you think if same-sex marriage were overturned federally, that it would impact the state of Massachusetts?
Yes and no. We now have protections in Massachusetts in place. They've deemed our, via the Constitution, that we're safe. On the abortion front, I work with the ACLU on a bill that just passed last session that would protect abortion rights. So we're safe theoretically, unless on the abortion front, Congress would have passed something to deny us the right to choose. But where we're not safe on marriage equality is if you cross the border into another state. So while you're in the confines of Massachusetts, but don't go on a vacation, or don't choose the wrong state to go on a vacation. One of the things we were just working on this a few weeks ago was trying to put in place legislation to protect providers of both abortion care and gender-affirming care, because some of the red states are increasingly passing laws not only against abortion, but against trans kids and trans families, and saying they can't provide gender-affirming care for those kids. Some of those people for abortions and gender-affirming care are going to come to Massachusetts to get provided here by our doctors. We need to see if we can protect our doctors at least as much as possible, and we've been working on legislation to do just that. So stay in Massachusetts and you might be safe. Cross the border, all bets are off.
If you have questions for Arline or Janson, just raise your hand and we'll get over and get the question and bring it on up to them. So please feel free to participate in our conversation. Janson, where were you when the Roe v. Wade leak, this draft opinion came out? Do you remember where you were and what your immediate reaction to it was? Or have you blocked it?
I was home, I believe it was an evening or weekend, so technically off hours, but what does that mean anymore? My immediate reaction was to think about my family members who would be most directly impacted, thinking again about my sister who's an abortion provider in Michigan, thinking about my young daughter and the type of world she'd be growing up in. That was my immediate concern. And then I think we also had, a job, as the head of an LGBTQ rights organization, to provide accurate and responsible information to our community. And so the first thing that we said to everybody is, this is a leaked opinion. This is not the law yet. Roe remains good law, and if you need access to abortion, here's where you can go. So that was our primary focus, was to ensure that people could still access safe and accessible abortions while they still could.
Sue, it's an interesting question that you asked that, because for those of us who have been working on abortion rights for a long time, a lot of us were anticipating this is what would happen. But when we got the news, almost uniformly, we were crushed. It's as though we hadn't anticipated it. It was just devastating to see they actually did it, even though we were expecting it to happen.
I wasn't surprised. I mean, if you follow the oral arguments, you follow the confirmation hearing, you count to 5. I think we've seen this coming for a long time. There has been a conservative legal movement for decades whose sole goal was to overturn Roe by creating legal theories about originalism and about textualism that were not necessarily consistent in their application, but really targeted to this primary goal. So this is something we've seen coming for a long time. And I think it just further, refines the point that elections matter in the composition of our highest court.
Have one of the questions from our audience. Do you support term limits for Supreme Court justices, or do you think that we should add to the existing number of justices on the court?
I support term limits for the justices I don't agree with. And I would like to add more people to the court if and only if they agree with me.
Agree with you. You can trust Arline to tell you what she's thinking. Go ahead. I expect a more nuanced answer from you, Janson.
I believe the court has to reflect the diversity of our country and the lived experiences of our country in order to have legitimacy and in order to come to the best decisions. Does our court currently look like that? No. What are the ways to get it to look more representative of our electorate and the people who live in this country? There's lots of ways to do it, to reform the courts in order to achieve that goal. I'll also just add that there is also important to bring back credibility and integrity to the process by which we nominate and confirm judges. And I will go there when it comes to Gorsuch's seat and the way that was stolen from Obama's administration.
I will say, though, that diversity doesn't solve the problem. Case in point, Clarence Thomas.
And who else? Amy Coney
Oh,
Barrett.
and exactly, yes.
Yeah, I mean,
that's
it's,
right.
yeah, the diversity is not an answer. It's unless.
Diversity of thought, maybe.
Yeah. So you touched a little bit on this, and this is a complicated issue. I was trying to explain to my daughter, talking about what happened in California during the same-sex marriage battles, where you had some couples who were some same-sex couples who were legally married, and then other same-sex couples who may not have been able to be legally married. So we were actually creating a subset of a minority within a minority of some who could have the right and some who couldn't. Obviously, that all got cleared out with the Supreme Court ruling for same-sex marriage. But if same-sex marriage gets reversed, and this is a question from the audience, couples who are married, does that impact them? And is there a legal route for a lawsuit if one couple is married, you're married, but I can't get married? Is there a legal remedy there if the right to marriage gets overturned?
To answer the question, I kind of want to look backwards and look at the period between 2004 and 2015. 2004 is when the first same-sex couples in the country could marry, thanks to the Goodrich decision and the powerful work of political advocates like Arline in protecting that decision. And then, 2015 is when, that freedom to marry was available to all Americans. But between those dates, it was a patchwork. There were some states where you could marry, there were some states where you couldn't marry, there were some states that wouldn't recognize your marriage. When the Federal Defense of Marriage Act was still the law of the land, you could be married in Massachusetts but unmarried when you had to file your federal taxes. And it was a mess. It was a mess for families who had to fill out 2 tax returns. It was a mess for employers who had to find ways to treat their employees equally, even though their marriages may not be respected across state lines for multi-state employers. It was a mess when it came to the rights and protections for children and the relationships to the parents, which I know we'll talk about a little bit later on in this program. And so, what it will look like should Obergefell fall, I don't know. But we certainly know that it will create a whole host of problems for individuals, families, and institutions who have relied upon the stability of those marriage licenses for over a decade.
And when these issues were being danced around in our state legislature here, I used to talk to the legislators who are uncomfortable with marriage equality and say to them, are you really suggesting that you're going to force us to get divorced? And they hadn't thought of it that way. It's like they might be against marriage equality, but forcing someone to get divorced was a different framework for them, and it really challenges the religious right.
I want to talk about an event that's happening today at the State House, which you're both involved in. I think there's often folks think, oh, marriage is all set, marriage equality is all set in Massachusetts, same-sex couples can adopt children, there's all sorts of things and protections that we have, but there's still a very big area. What is happening at the State House today, Janson, and what are the legal things that you're working on to protect families?
So GLAD and Arline have been working for years now to pass a bill called the Massachusetts Parentage Act. And what the Massachusetts Parentage Act would do would be to fill the gaps and holes in our family laws through which so many LGBTQ and non-LGBTQ families are falling through. families where the parents are not married, families with donor-conceived children, families, single-parent families. These are all families who weren't protected through marriage equality. And we've seen the harms to those families. Families where if the parents split up, there is a huge battle over who is a legal parent. Families who have difficulty getting their kids on their health care because that legal protection of parentage is not securely in place. Massachusetts is the last state in New England to update its family laws to include the wide diversity of families that exist in our society. And so while I'm so proud of Massachusetts for being a forerunner on so many issues, this is one where they're actually lagging behind. And so we really encourage folks, if you're around 3 o'clock in front of the State House, to lend your voice and to call your representatives to ask them to pass the Massachusetts Parentage Act.
What's the appetite at the State House for this?
Well,
Arline?
legislators understand that they have not updated these laws in 40 years. And in 40 years, assisted reproductive technology has grown, surrogacy has grown. Our families sometimes, often, look different, very different than families in the straight world. And so they have to update the laws to include us. They didn't intentionally exclude us, but we are now excluded in so very many ways. Parentage, it shouldn't be based on biology. And we have to clarify in the law who is a parent and what does it mean to be a parent and what does it mean to have parentage. It's a very child-centered bill. It protects the kids who could be hugely harmed if their parents aren't recognized as such because they're not biologically connected.
And if I could just connect this with our previous conversation about Obergefell, some of the protections in the Massachusetts Parentage Act will be even more critical should marriage equality no longer be the law of the land. And I'll give you one example. So Massachusetts was a leader when it came to making available to unmarried parents a very simple process to declare themselves a legal parented. And this is through a form that most straight couples fill out at the hospital called the Voluntary Acknowledgement of Parentage Form. It was it is the same as a court order. It has the legal force of court order. It can travel across state lines. It is like getting an adoption decree, right? And yet, only straight couples could access that form, not same-sex couples. Few years ago,
with no DNA test.
With no
either,
DNA
by the
test,
way.
and
Like,
we know a number of those fathers are not
right,
genetic
a
fathers.
woman gives birth to a baby, and the man, the unmarried partner, signs it saying that's my baby, and there's no my biological child, and there's no DNA test.
And there's important public policy reason for that is because the state wants to ensure that the child has this economic security, which often comes through child support.
Or they could chase him for
Right,
child
exactly.
support. Right.
But it's also we know that
I
children
might be
do
telling
better.
too much about my family.
We know, though, that children do better in secure households with the support of at least two parents. So anyway, these important forms, processes, VAPs, are available to unmarried couples regardless of sex. They're not available to married couples. Now, what happens if Obergefell is overturned and all of a sudden Oklahoma decides it's not going to recognize the marriages of same-sex couples in Massachusetts upon which their parental relationship with their children relies upon, right? And so those marriages are no longer enough to secure their parentage rights in Oklahoma, then it's going to be even more important for them to be able to access those VAPs.
Not only, as Janson pointed out, are we the only state in New England that has not updated its laws, but we are the state with the most assisted reproductive technological births in the entire nation. So we need it here more than anywhere else, and we need it so that someone can leave the state, be protected when they go to a state that doesn't recognize us.
All right, let's stay with the dark idea of if Obergefell gets overturned. Question from the audience: what would happen to my insurance benefits if gay married couples, if you're no longer seen as married?
Well, I think it's a complicated question. I'd be happy to talk to whoever asked that question individually. I think a lot of it will depend upon the type of insurance you have. Is it private or is it public? But even before marriage equality, employers found ways to ensure that they were treating their employees equally and fairly, because that's just good business. That's how you recruit employees. It is a given at this point, for most of the top 500, Fortune 500 companies, that you have to treat LGBTQ employees the same as cis and straight employees.
Unless you're a federal employee, of an employee of the federal government or an employee of the anti-gay corporations like Hobby Lobby and Chick-fil-A. So you'd have to, or a Catholic hospital.
Or Cumberland Farms, who had self-insurance, if I remember correctly,
point.
That's right.
and was able to not insure their gay married couples because they were following the federal guidelines rather than the state
right.
guidelines.
Yeah, I mean, I think the bottom line is we will lose a very important legal tool to ensure that bad actors are doing the right thing.
All right, so couple more questions. One is obviously hate crimes have been increasing across the country for all sorts of communities. Is there a concern that they ask the overturning of gay marriage, but even the discussion of it will increase harm against LGBTQ citizens?
Well, we're already seeing increases over the last 4 years in particular, since Trump was the president. There's been a surge in hate crimes against the LGBTQ community, particularly bad for the trans community and especially bad for Black trans women. The threats don't go away. The people who feel that way, I mean, we all got hate mail during the battles on marriage equality, and those people haven't moved out of state. Some of them hopefully have evolved, but a lot of them haven't. And when you've got Marjorie Taylor Greene doing podcasts every day saying that we're trying to change the world, make everybody gay, or saying that we're trying to destroy heterosexuality, these, by the way, are arguments we used to hear 40 years ago. I can't believe they're coming back now, but with that kind of rhetoric out there, hate crimes will increase.
If I could just underline a really important point Arline just said, it's like we're talking about the future risks, but we are in a state of crisis and we are under an onslaught of attacks right now. I think I said earlier, but over 300 anti-LGBTQ bills introduced in states across the country, and these are bills that are targeting the most vulnerable in our populations, particularly transgender young people, kicking them off the soccer team, or preventing them from getting medically necessary life-saving health care. GLAAD right now just is suing the state of Alabama for criminalizing medically necessary health care for transgender youth, and we actually just got an incredible opinion putting that law on hold from a Trump-appointed judge. So there is still possibility, there is still hope, for justice to prevail, even with the most unlikely of corners. But it requires all of us now, and not sometime in the future, should Obergefell falls, to get engaged.
And that's why the Mass Parentage Act becomes so important, because with all these red states passing these horrible laws against our people, we need that protection of the Mass Parentage Act now more than ever, because it affects kids every day of their lives, every single day. And so they can't avoid it. It affects their health insurance. It can affect their education, their access, to medical records, who takes care of them, so they don't go into a foster care system if their biological parent can't take care of them, which happens all the time.
So let's talk solutions. Questions from the audience. Obviously, it's Pride Month. One question is, what can we do aside from joining marches, which I think is a true question all the time. Marches are great, gathering is great, but what action can they take? And also this one, for those happy people who live in a bubble, what is the best way for us to impact the national discussion on Roe v. Wade and LGBTQ rights?
Allies have always been our best weapon. We could never have won the rights we have just by ourselves. We are demographically, numerically, not enough of us. We need our families and our friends and our colleagues and our neighbors to help in these battles. How to get things changed in Massachusetts, how to pass the Mass Parentage Act, is to call legislators and say, please pass this. I didn't know this was an issue. Now that I do, I'd like you to support House 1714. Please vote for that bill. We need our allies to do that too. And in other states, we all have family and friends who live elsewhere. We need to start lining them up to be allies with their own elected officials.
Yeah, and I would add, don't take anything for granted. That's my biggest message. Because even our allies, even our friends in state legislatures and in Congress have competing interests as well too. And they're hearing from our opposition 10-1. So GLAAD right now is in a campaign to help pass the Equality Act through the Senate. And the Equality Act would solve so many of the problems and protect our community from so many of the attacks we're seeing across the country. It would add federal non-discrimination protections in housing, in public spaces, in credit, in jury service, in healthcare. And this is a bill we've been trying to pass for decades now. And we are so close. Our window of opportunity is closing very, very, very soon. Very, very, very soon. And it may close for a long time after the November election. We will see.
If the midterms
go.
Turn the House or the Senate
Exactly.
over to Republican.
Exactly. And so, we are asking everyone to contact your senators and ask people that you know in purple states to contact their senators. But especially even in blue states, even in states with, pro-equality senators, they still need to hear that support from us because our opposition is outcalling us 10-1 right now.
And in Massachusetts, we're lucky at the state level that we have some LGBTQ elected officials in the legislature who are in high positions, Julian Sear, Kate Hogan, Sarah Peake, et cetera. But they can't control all their colleagues. And unless legislators hear from their constituents to pass the Massachusetts Parentage Act, it's not going to happen.
Janson Wu from GLAAD, Arline Isaacson from the Massachusetts, what are you calling yourself these days? Everyone keeps adding letters.
We keep adding initials,
Okay.
yeah, LGBTQ.
Caucus.
Political caucus.
Thank you both. Happy Pride to both of you. Thanks so much for joining us here at Lunch Hour Live. Thank you to everyone in the audience.